NSCAD and a few other sundry items of business. And I'll start off the questioning with...
Why don't you have a seat
Yeah.
and we'll sit.
Start off the questioning. I don't know. Let's just go with... how does the NSCAD residency, now that you're nearing the end, compare to, say, the I-beam residency that you were engaged in? Has there been more opportunity for you to do work, or less, or have you been more confounded by... Sorry, as you heard.
Well, they're two entirely different things. The I-beam residency involved meetings among the fellows and the fellows with the residents. I was a resident. A fellow has a different status, a higher status in the organization. It's changing completely now because they're moving to Brooklyn. Right. They're building a new place and stuff. It may be a little more formal than it used to be. I really don't know. I'm not associated with them, but there was access to tools there. For example, I had access to a 3D printer on a fairly continuous basis, which was absolutely fantastic. And there was a stipend of $5,000, and that also went into buying, say, materials for the 3D printer. So I was using that tool a lot.
Right.
I don't think I used much else. I did use some 3D modeling stuff that they had, but it was mainly the printer. And then I was able to keep tools down there, and the collaboration, the talks and collaboration with everyone was fantastic. Yeah. Now, so here it's on this, because it's a NSCAD, it's a different situation. This in a way has been extremely amenable. I mean, I did close to 4 weeks with a number of storms in it, but I was able to speak to 5 classes, meet with a number of students, do that public presentation that I did, and produce a lot of work, which is going up online. And I'm also editing a special issue of Truck magazine, which is a avant-garde poetics magazine, poetry magazine. Right. And I'm doing that at the same time. So it's a lot of stuff.
So speaking about storms, in the material that you've been putting up online, that you've graciously shared with many of us, weather features very prominently in your...
Well, weather is featured very... First of all,
is this part of your...
It is part of my interests.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in what's normally considered bad weather or extreme weather, and my highest peak moment was about 2 years ago now, when we had a tornado in Brooklyn, and I went out underneath it. So I was shooting up. I had a high-definition video camera. I could only stay out for about 15-20 seconds. The wind was howling, and everything was... There were a lot of things in the air. But I was able to hold on, and you can hear the wind shear just suddenly switch in the camera, and it's kind of fantastic. So I tend to like bad weather if there's... So when Hurricane Sandy came, I went out in the height of it with Azure, and there were things blowing all over the place again, and there was cars that were damaged, and trees down, and power lines down, and everything, and parts of buildings, kind of sidings coming off and stuff, and we went out in that. In the middle of the storm. So
I've known you for a number of years, several decades in fact, but looking back, many people would recognize you as a kind of an exemplary intermedia artist. You're engaged in poetry and in video explorations and web explorations, in music, interdisciplinary work, collaborative work with other artists, writing, curatorial projects. And over the past 40 years, is there one particular practice that you would say provides a signature for the Ellen Sondheim?
I honestly don't think so. I don't know what it would be.
Right.
Writing has always been really difficult for me, but writing seems to be the way for an outsider to approach issues of science or logic, philosophy, in a way that is difficult for other media. Although I see my work as having philosophical import, but it still has to be grounded in language. So the language brings it home. In terms of personal exploration and delight, so to speak, a lot has to do with music.
Yeah.
And playing music is about the only physical thing I'm really good at.
Right.
And I can play music well.
Yeah.
So that provides me with a personal joy, and then I end up pushing the music that I'm doing to one extreme or another.
Right. I was very taken with some of your writings that were published in Deep Language, 2010. And one of your pieces is titled, How Am I Doing? So in some ways that previous question was an attempt to get at how am I doing. You start off in this with, how am I doing? You're doing fine. Why do you ask? I don't think I'm doing fine. There are too many people against me, online and offline. Do you think everywhere there's no difference now? The world's increasingly porous. Just look around you. Reality's a hack. Online is open, real. Reality is open source. You're upset about quantum mechanics. Now, I love this because, when you talk about philosophical underpinnings for your work, and also your deep interest in physics and mathematics, and the early assaults on reality and consciousness. Can I ask, how do you think you're doing now? How are you doing? Are you still interested in pursuing your signature themes like death and trauma, melancholy, the reality effect, and the avatar equation, always being or concerning yourself with questions of alterity and sexuality, desire, and so
those are all there. Those are all still there.
Yeah.
In the work. I find that both the practice of that material and thinking through it in my private life at this point is kind of destructive in a way. In other words, it's too difficult. I've had some traumatic experiences in the last couple of years, and the work, this kind of work, just sort of swirls around that, contributes to that. So again, that's why things like music or watching soccer help relieve that.
Right.
I've become much more interested in cosmology. I've been interested in cosmology on and off for years, and the field is changing so rapidly. And it's also so technical now that it's really difficult to keep up with what's happening in terms of cosmology, but I sort of feel that's where truth and beauty lie, if they lie anywhere, at least for me. Issues of the multiverse or string theory or recent things with the cosmic microwave background. This stuff fascinates me, and it does affect the work.
Yeah.
So I feel we're riding a kind of Aristotelian logical wave, in a sense, in an intermediary plane of existence in terms of space. Spatial size in terms of temporal span.
Right.
You get smaller, you get larger, and you're in very, very alienating and alien environments.
Right. So when you talk about music, and I know that you engage and have done for a number of years in collaborative work with Azure, and you've put out some CDs, done some beautiful recordings. Azure has a beautiful voice. You're a you're a very talented musician with stringed instruments, and you choose ethnic instruments often to...
Well, I wouldn't say ethnic, I would say every instrument's an ethnic instrument.
Okay, very good. I'll take that as a...
But, for example, this, which I'm going to practice in case we do something on Wednesday.
Yeah. Would you want to play a few chords on that?
Well, it's not a chordal instrument. It's called a kura saz. Chumbush saz. Or chumbush sword. I'm so tired.
Oh, so you pluck it?
Yeah, it's a chumbush kura.
Chumbush kura.
Yeah. Chumbush is this metal part.
So
and the kura is a small saz, and this is a small saz. And if you notice, the frets are very irregular. So
yeah, and it's Turkish. So
yeah,
it looks like
it's actually more sophisticated in terms of frets than a Western instrument because it's not logarithmic. It's in terms of natural tuning and Arabic tuning. So you can do stuff like.
Very good.
And that would be hard to do.
Yeah.
Or impossible on a Western guitar.
Right.
The intervals are just very different.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like it's a different number of strings, a banjo, mandolin.
It's a different number of strings, but also they use a round robin string so that this and this on the other end are the same.
Yeah.
So the middle one is actually lower than this, but then this is lower than this. So it goes around in a way.
Yeah. So would you, at this period in your life, when you can look back over 40 or 45 years...
God.
Oh, God. And, when I first met you, I saw you as a major figure until you could have been producing a number of anthologies like individuals. And that you could have been the Gregory Batcock of your...
I tried to do another one on French and British art, and for my sake, luckily, they didn't bring it out.
Right. Yeah.
I was also way over my head, I think, in it. I mean, trying to deal with people like Sapor Safas and the early Annette Messager and Christian Boltanski and Buran. These were all some of the people that I'd asked to be in it. Yeah. I forget who the others were. So,
and you were...
But it never appeared. I got paid about half the advance on it, but the book itself never appeared, and I think they were worried about the sale of individuals. They never advertised individuals for some reason. I think actually it slipped through the cracks. I don't think it was anything deliberate on Dutton's part because they had invested in it. So I think individuals are really was the be-all and the end-all of that.
Now, getting back to your early period at NSCAD, because some people listening to this might be interested in that. You first came here, I believe, in 1976, was it? Or was it, 73?
It might have been 73.
And then you came back in 76 or 77?
I was here about 5 times. I really don't remember the dates.
And I know that in Gary Kennedy's MIT book, The Last Art College, you appear a number of times.
Yeah.
And I know from when I arrived in 76, the name Alan Sondheim was indicative of someone who was internationally connected and who brought a number of people like Laurie Anderson and a number of others into...
Laurie might have been the only one. I think I brought other people, but I brought Tom Zimmer and Leslie Thornton, I think.
Leslie Thornton. Yeah. Right, yeah.
I brought
and of course, the other person at that time who was doing a lot in terms of bringing people in was David Askevold and also Dan Graham,
right,
who brought in Dara Birnbaum and a number of other.
Well, David and Dan seem to be the two sort of mainstays of, and and Ian Murray later.
And Ian Murray,
even as a student, he was the one who organized the shows that I had at the Anna Leonowin's over there at Coburg.
So you remember the Coburg campus?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
Which
I remember the upper gallery space. They tore it down, and now they've got a computer center there.
Yeah, which is now actually they tore that old building down.
Right.
Which was a modernist, purpose-built by a person who became quite a well-known local architect and who was on our board for a number of years. So So going back to your interest in language, because I think that's fundamental to your practice.
I want to say
language and philosophy, right?
Yeah, I want to say one thing in terms of recording here, and that is that, and I mentioned this to you before, and certainly talked to David Clark about it. Is I never found the school a particularly conceptually oriented one. I mean, I know that there was a Larry Wiener influence, but it always seemed to me that the people who were most interesting, and the book I did, that individuals book, also was organized around a very anti-conceptualist stance.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm interested, and I still am interested in people who are dealing with problematic or troubling content,
Right.
where the content determines the form, and so, or the two get entangled. And certainly with Askeval, that was the case. And I noticed in the Askeval catalog that he's called a conceptualist, and that just
it
boggles my mind, because he wasn't. And you know, I think,
well, he was a mystic in a way.
or I would think more shamanic.
Yeah, shamanic.
I mean, he was really interested in that, in imbuing objects with a kind of life of their own.
In fact, Michael Asher would have been someone you would more clearly identify with conceptualism.
Yeah, definitely. And art language people.
The art and language people.
Solowitz, stuff like that,
yeah. And, so some of your poetry is quite erotic, but I'm not going to go there for this discussion.
That's better.
But, for example, some of your language work, I can call it language work rather than poetry, is often very figural. So, for example, you have future anterior, K 29%, R, sent 1 plus 1. Do you want to read that out?
Future anterior.
It's almost impossible to read.
Yeah, it's, I'm not quite sure. When it does R, and then it has the percent sign 1 plus 1, then it's saying that it's, this is not found.
Right.
So it's not in the history, so it's like I'm trying to locate in the history. This is the history of the prompts, what the prompts are doing in Linux, Unix, and it said that this particular thing is not found, and then future anterior and the future not found.
Yeah. Even
though future anterior results in KSH returning in the future not found. So it's playing off of that. It's also playing off of this. No one would get this.
Yeah.
It's playing off of Derrida's writing about missiles and missives. I forget the name.
Right.
7 missives, 7 missiles, something like that was the title of that piece that dealt with.
Is that on grammatology?
I don't know. It was in Diacritics.
Right.
And it had a big effect on me, and it was about missiles, literally guided missiles, being fired, and missives, and playing off of that. But it had a geopolitical turn to the essay at the time. So
I'm glad you mentioned Jacques Derrida, because he's, certainly a philosopher I've been influenced heavily by. And I remember reading the English translation of The Truth in Painting when it first came out, being astounded.
It's a really nice book.
Yeah, it's a nice book, and his discussion of to whom the unlaced peasant shoes of Van Gogh addressed. It's something that.
So I'm not sure, but I think I told you that I was at a conference.
Yeah.
That Derrida was at, and I kept pushing my way through the crowd and photographing his shoes because I wanted that to go back and resonate. Yeah. And they were ordinary looking, sort of almost like workman's boots. As far as I remember, I probably got it totally wrong. Right. But I remember that they
were workman's boots.
Yeah, so they...
Yeah, and they were unlaced, and he did several, drawings and paintings of those.
Well, that was Van Gogh, you're talking about.
Van Gogh.
Yeah.
But
I photographed Derrida's shoes as a resonance on top of that. Yeah.
And he was quite a sharp dresser, I seem to remember.
Yeah.
And he even confessed in a film that he was somewhat narcissistic. So, but he would, deconstruct that narcissism. So, shifting register here a little bit. I know that Jewishness is a theme within your work. And there are some Jewish writers like Bernard Malamud, who I have a great affection for. I remember reading pictures of Feidelman when I was quite young, and thinking, this is an artist it's like a warning for all artists that, and the story of Feidelman,
I didn't read that one.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. This artist goes through all the history of post-war styles of art. He starts off as an abstract expressionist artist, and then he moves and becomes a pop artist. Then he becomes a minimal artist. Then he becomes every time he changes his style and way of working, he changes his lovers. And then he ends up thinking that he has to do the grand tour, and he goes to Italy. And he starts to do conceptual art and earth art in Italy, arte povera. And then he meets an Italian woman, sets up shop with her, and then she dumps him. So he decides that he's got to leave Rome and go to Florence, where he knows that there's some good studios. So then he meets a glassblower who's from Venice, and he says, "You must come to Venice." The glassblower is a man, and he said, "I'll take you to my glassblowing establishment studio." And Feidelman starts to fall in love with this man, and he finally founds his métier in glassblowing. So he moves through all of these styles of contemporary art into craft, and becomes and changes his sexual orientation. And I think it's one of these brilliant novels that all young artists should read, because it provides a kind of a warning. It's the kind of warning that Buren signaled to in Beware when he started to define the boundaries of his work and the limits. It's a very Derridian kind of process. And I've felt, looking back over my career, that I've moved in and out of a lot of different ways of working. But so are there any Jewish writers that you think of?
The two writers that well, first of all, I want to say something about the erotic stuff,
right?
Because I read erotic language is processed differently in the brain. It actually goes through different pathways than non-erotic language. If what I've read is correct, it may or may not. Okay, so I was saying that erotic language, particularly obscenities, are processed differently in the brain than non-erotic language. They call up different functions, different parts of the brain. And so it's interesting to work with that, because that relates very directly to the body and body imagery. So you could actually have a kind of phenomenology of obscenity, right, in a sense, that takes you to different places philosophically, right, or than ordinary declarative language. Right. The same thing if you use interjections. If I call help or use interjections, different things are called up. It's not all standardized language processing. The same way that Wittgenstein, you have idealized protocol sentences. It's not like that at all. Yeah. Okay, so you were asking about language. You were asking about the Jewish influence. Yeah,
I was asking about Jewish writers.
So the two that would influence me the most would, none of the novelists, but were, and still are, Jabez and Paul Celan. Yeah, both of those people, by far over other writers, right, have influenced me. I've also been influenced to some extent by Karl Kraus, right, and by Adorno, and right, these are Jewish writers, yeah, as well. So it would fall within those areas.
Yeah. Now, I know that you've done a lot of work in Second Life, and that becomes your first life in a way. What first attracted you to Second Life as a kind of game?
The fact that it's very fast, and you can almost, once you learn how to do things, it's not Second Life. I mean, today I was into MacGrid, for example.
MacGrid, yeah.
And you can do things very, very quickly in MacGrid. Like I just made two mountains really quickly, and then there was a sort of declivity in the middle of the two mountains, so there's two peaks. like a letter M, and I put the avatar in the middle, and then there's a white light, like glacial lights, shining on one of the mountains from the avatar, and so I was able to work with that and make a video, which I'll have done by the end of the day. But this is very fast to do something very elaborate.
Yeah.
So I can do that kind of thing. I can. It's very supple. It's kind of an idealized art medium in a sense, as it's the closest thing to a holodeck that you can have now if you're going into the virtual. Now this is going to all change probably within 2 or 3 years.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised if Second Life disappears and something else comes in that's more connected with gaming or augmented reality and so forth. But right now, Second Life provides you with a virtual world that you can modify pretty much extensively in any direction you want. In Met Grid, you can do a lot more modifications than you can in Second Life. I mean, it's really extreme modifications that you can do there, because the sims are placed much more, the permissions are given much more to you as a user within the Met Grid than they are within Second Life, or than the Open Sim is also fairly open, but Met Grid's the most open of all. So in these areas you can go in Second Life, because it's got a worldwide population, you can have an art opening in a particular space in Second Life.
Right.
And then people can come in from all over the place and watch the performance, watch what you're doing, see what you've built. They can sometimes alter it if you let them, and participate in it. And so it's also a good place for meetings.
So it's like an alternative
It's an
art
alternative
world.
reality, which is, it's, and some people do standard things. They build galleries, and Ian Murray, who has built a gallery in this space called Odyssey, and I got a show there. And this woman who was running at Sugar Seville allowed the show to run for 8 months, I think, which is unusual. But that meant I could go in and do anything I wanted in the museum space for the 8 months. And I didn't really know what I was doing technically then, but I very quickly picked it up. And the first thing I did was I took the entire museum apart. So there was no roof, there were no walls, there were things coming through in all directions, parts of the floor disappeared and so forth, so that I was able to use an open space that had like a ghost or a shadow of a museum there. And that went really well, you just couldn't do this in the real world. And I don't have access to, say, the kind of museological experiences that somebody like Chris Burden can take advantage of.
So what does this do to the curator and the museological apparatus? There's
very little.
It just dispenses with them altogether in a way.
Well, no, I mean, I was curated into the space. I've been curated into other spaces. When I am curated into a space, then depending on what the space is, if it's something that's a very elaborate sculptural or architectural piece that's been built up, again, this is all virtual, I'll mind my manners, so to speak. I'm not going to take over the people's land or anything like that, or try to. That would be, everybody sort of collaborates with everybody else. There are people who are deliberately destructive or like creating troubles in Second Life. And I tend to try to avoid those people, because I'm more interested in creating my own world than I am in negotiating through someone else's havoc. Although I appreciate the havoc, I just don't have the time for it.
But the borders in Second Life, correct me if I'm wrong, are fairly porous, right?
Not really. You have permissions. So you have permissions to do things in one place or another. Like, I have permission. I don't have permissions to change the landforms. At least I don't think I do in Odyssey. These are formal permissions. If I was given that, then I could build a mountain on top of everybody's work, or make it slide off the mountain, or whatever. But I don't have those permissions. I have permission to change the standardized video texture in the platform I'm using in Odyssey, but I can't change the video texture for anybody else's platform. So this kind of thing. I can, in some places, if you don't have ownership of the land, or you don't have permissions, you're not able to build anything on the land, or you can put something there, but it'll just disappear. You can't keep it there permanently. So it's all this kind of negotiation that goes on. I pay something like $240 a year, which gives me this platform in the sky, so it's $20 a month. For a studio space that I could also use as a gallery space, and that's great. I mean, it's not that expensive.
That dispenses with you know, having to have a, you know, elaborate system of websites or...
Well, no, because you only do one kind of work in Second Life.
Right.
Azure, for example, has 5 blogs.
Right.
You know, and each one does a different thing. There's one on ornithology in relationship to education. There's one for family and friends.
Right.
There's one. There's a gallery that she's set up. You know this. So I don't do that, but occasionally I'll set up a blog for one reason or another. You know, and work within that blog. And then the blogs sometimes just become orphans, or sometimes I'll keep them going.
Yeah.
My own website, unfortunately, because I don't have the time to change it now, my own website has about 3,000 or 4,000, probably more, files in it, and it's nothing but a directory.
Right.
And so I use it as an online directory that I can then send people to from email lists or from Facebook,
right.
You know, this kind of thing.
Yeah. So that's like the French artist Ben, and a lot of artists now have newsletters. They send out newsletters.
Yeah.
You know, once a month.
I'm a friend of Ben Vaudier.
Ben Vaudier.
Yeah, I'm a friend of his on Facebook. I quite like what he does.
Yeah, so am I.
And I liked his work
a
lot. There was a lot of it in Soho, in Chelsea when I was down there.
Yeah. How do you feel about the social networks like LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter? Do you have a Twitter feed? Or
I did. I stopped doing it because I just don't have the time. I don't do LinkedIn because I don't have the time. I do Facebook extensively.
Yeah.
I feel that I feel that human beings are in a kind of vile position in a way, because Google, I mean, this isn't the time to go into it, but Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple all are controlling extensively what we do, what we see. You know, every time I go out, for example, here in Halifax, you know, you go anywhere and everybody is looking at their iPhones.
Yes.
So they're buying into an Apple ecology, which is also a blood ecology.
Right.
But they're buying into an ecology, and they are literally not seeing what's around them. You know, they become very dependent, very addictive on these devices.
Yeah.
And I just, you know, as well as the fact that there's so much information. You know, just today I was reading about I think it's called the Bleeding Heart hack. Yeah, and I was reading about that, and that, you know, we've had identity theft, and we're fairly careful.
Yeah.
And then some things that are supposed to protect you, like McAfee. I find McAfee, as my brother has said, I find McAfee itself to be a kind of malware. It's spamming. It places itself all over on a hard drive, and it's very hard to eradicate. You can take out all the files, you know, with uninstall the program, and you still find bits and pieces all over the place, and God knows what they're doing. So I think we're in for a disaster as a result of this. We're far too dependent on these technologies.
Yeah. Well, how do you feel about, I know a lot of authors are worried about the disappearing print culture because of...
I'm not worried about it. I love books.
Publishing
I love books. I mean, even here I bought some 19th century books that are remarkable. So I love books. If people steal my work online, or, you know, if there's... I really don't care. So I'm not really concerned about copyright issues.
Just to raise that. You sure? Yeah?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It's not like I have something that's patentable. It's going to make a huge amount of money. And I've actually seen my work appear under other people's names, and that's fine.
What?
Yeah, I mean, mainly actually in print, actually in like punk magazines, and that's fine. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
You know, for me, it's about dissemination, and worrying about copyright is something that would just, given the amount of writing I do and the amount of stuff I put in. Now, if it's a work where I do get very concerned and angry, if it's a work such as the videotape I did with Kathy Acker, because that tape is psychologically loaded, if that's presented without permission, and it has been, it's very upsetting to me, and I will try to follow through on that. There shouldn't be copies of that out there.
Yeah. Mm.
So that's a different situation. But by and large, and it involves someone else, but by and large in my work, it doesn't bother me.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So what, after you leave Halifax and NSCAD, what follows from...
Well, I've got 13 I probably have close to 1,500 pictures now,
right.
and files and texts that I'm going to work one way or another here.
Right.
And I'll take that material back and continue thinking about it in the States. I started dealing with issues of blank whiteness, like on the edges of maps or on the edges of, the edges of maps, or as a result of the blizzard. You know, I've always been fascinated by whiteouts. Mm-hmm. I had the most frightening experience of my life, driving experience, returning one time from NSCAD to the United States, and I was driving down towards Yarmouth, and the roads were fairly local at that point in the 70s, and there was a blizzard hit, and we were on the road in the middle of the night with like 3 or 4 RISD students in the car, and it was absolute white. You could not see anything at all, nothing. So I put my foot, I opened the door of the car, and I had my foot, and we literally went for a couple hours at about 5 miles an hour with the door open, and feeling when I was going too far off the road. In other words, when the pavement...
With your foot?
With my foot.
Oh my God.
Because I couldn't see anything. At one point, we managed to pull off and contact the RC. It was before cell phone. And contact the RCMP, and they said the storm was too severe, they couldn't send anybody out.
Oh God.
And I think it took us like 12 hours or something to get from here to Yarmouth, from Halifax to Yarmouth. And it was really frightening. But at the same time, I'm really fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by these really severe storms. I told you I fell in the waters of Peggy's Cove at one point.
Yes,
Almost drowned, almost frozen. Yeah. And
in fact, a lot of 2 or 3 people die there every year.
Yeah, I know. And this was the dead of winter. And Robin Collier and Ian were there, I think. I know Robin was, and I think Robin was the one who helped pull me out. I found the exact spot where this happened when I was with Azure this time. We photographed the spot. So again, this stuff just fascinates me. And then you have the crevices and the rocks around Peggy's Cove, which is the easiest place to see these. Yeah. And I was talking about this at the presentation I did, and you try to actually read that map the same way you read scars on a person's face. You try to read the physiognomy of the rocks, and it's impossible. You can get to a certain limit, and then it dissolves. Something streaks out of the way. Like there's one place where there's a crevice with small horizontal cuts, evenly spaced in that. And I have no idea what created that, but it was clearly something that connected to maybe another space over 50 feet away. That kind of thing. So that was really, that fascinates me. So there are issues of scarification, issues of blankness, of whiteout when everything disappears and your imagination starts filling these spaces like happened. And I want to work on that.
And you're interested in trauma and mortality.
But that doesn't figure in this so much. Yeah. This is more like exaltation, in a sense. Yeah. In other words, there's something really magical when you have whiteout, and when you walk out in the blizzard like that, and the blizzard literally takes you over, and you may be close to having frostbite. Those are really interesting experiences.
So extreme conditions. Have you ever been in a rainforest or a desert and experienced?
In the deserts in the American Southwest.
The extremities of those.
Yeah, to some extent in the deserts in the Southwest. And I went with my brother to Carmana, which is in British Columbia. It's old growth forest. Azure and I tend to look for old growth forests, and we look for fungi also, and slime molds. Yeah. You have wonderful slime molds up here, and then you have ctenophores, which I talked about, which are comb jellies, and I talked about those in the talk. So really remarkable life forms up here. Right.
So, I think that's, in your work it's evident that science and art, there's no opposition between, science, art, literature. They all inform one another, and in an amazing, and I think you build, for want of a better word, allegories in your work, allegories that enable the reader to at times be frustrated in their attempt to complete the incomplete, or to engage in a hermeneutic exploration where their interpretations of what you've delivered, either in text or visual work, video, audio, that they're left in a period of in a space of undecidability, where there's no possibility for closure in terms of their, which is good. There's a kind of anarchy there, in a way.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you completely.
And in some ways, the Duchampian notion that or Roland Barthes, with the death of the author comes the birth of the reader, or the viewer completes what the artist presents.
Well, for me, this brings up a really interesting issue, which is, for me, science is deeply and inherently unreadable.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it's almost impossible, I think, to translate cosmology, the equations of cosmology, particularly in particle physics, things like that, into anything that's understandable outside the equations. The equations tend towards territories that are remarkable for their inability to be represented in consciousness. I mean, even a simple way, you have a Hilbert space which can be infinite valued,
right,
and that's infinite dimensions, and there's no way to picture that. We can picture a little bit up in our minds up into 4 dimensions, or have some idea, but when we get to potential of 11 dimensions in string theory, in spite of the fact that they use these analogies of rugs being rolled up with the other dimensions inside the rugs, for me, those don't hold. And likewise, even time and space tend to dissolve when you start looking at the Planck limits and things like that. So, and I don't know the math, but I know that I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in that, and the same thing with multiverses. There's all these sort of fanciful 1950s models of universes like bubbles, but it's not like that. So, or the inflationary thing, the early inflation of the universe. I keep trying to explain this to a poet friend of mine. The little I do understand, that inflation can go faster than the speed of light. It doesn't contradict Einstein's theory of relativity, but it's difficult. They're really difficult concepts. So I both admire science for the fact that it's tracked into these directions, with tremendous experimental evidence leading the way. I don't think that this is fanciful stuff. People outside the sciences, tend to dismiss it all, just saying, oh, it's just mathematics. But it's not. It's inherent, I think, in the world in a very deep way. I'm fascinated by that. At the same time, I realize how little I understand of the results that are coming in. And then people like Leonard Susskind have been talking about that the world may be deeply not understandable, because if things are occurring beyond the cosmic horizon, if things that are leaving no trace, but yet at the same time they gave birth to what we see, one way or another, randomly or non-randomly, then there's no way to have an ultimate theory of everything. There just may be no path to something like that. And the math is getting more and more complicated as it goes on.
Yeah. So, and that hence your interest in string theory. Are you interested in?
I can't follow string theory mathematically. I certainly know what it's about, but I can't follow it mathematically.
Are you interested in, evolutionary uses of DNA, for example?
I'm really interested in that. I also feel the same way I feel about Web 2.0. I feel we're heading towards disaster. Artists are doing a lot of bioart. O'Reilly has a magazine which I get, an online magazine which I get and download about that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there was absolutely no understanding, as far as I can tell, among the people working in that area, or no consideration given, I should put it that way, for the devastation that invasive species are releasing this stuff into the wild, the damage that the trauma this stuff can do to the environment.
Yeah.
And I'm more interested personally in the environment than I am in bioart. That's just my own personal taste, so...
Yeah, similar to my take. In fact, 67, Doug Hubler wrote that the world is full of interesting things. He didn't want to add any more. And I think that, he was very prescient in that.
Oh, yeah,
in
definitely.
that conception, because artists today, are engaged in overproduction. The more objects that are produced, that's why I have, in art school, just think of art schools all around the world and how much material they're producing.
Yeah. But if you listen, stop and listen to the starlings. This is something Azra and I talk about, because there's been tremendous research done into starling song, and as I pointed this out at the talk, they're the only other animal who has a language that can recursively embed phrases. It's the starling song is incredibly complicated, and one of the things that's delighted us is the Nova Scotia starling songs are particularly complicated. They're much more complex here than I've heard in the States. For whatever reason, it may be in New York that the sonic level, the noise level is so high that birds have to compete in terms of volume, and birds are developing stronger and louder bird songs to compete on that level, particularly sparrows. But even the starlings we hear in Providence are not as elaborate as they are up here. Up here, it's phenomenal. If I had a chance to come back here, one of the things I would want to do is bring a parabolic microphone and record some of this, slow it down and try to figure out what's going on. It's really complicated.
I think there are some recordings of Nova Scotia birds.
Oh, I'm sure there was a lot of them, but I'm particularly interested in the sparrows and doing that myself.
Yeah. One of our local artists here, Andrew McLaren, his father is a professor, and he's an ornithologist at Dalhousie, Professor Emeritus. And he has a website that you can go to.
Wait, that's the guy.
That's the guy.
That's the guy who did the book, I think, called All the Birds in Nova Scotia.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, which I want to get, but it's $35.
Really?
Yeah. He also did the third edition of Tufts' book on Nova Scotia birds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have that.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the 17th of May, and I'm very pleased to be able to interview Alan Sondheim again.
Because it's the 17th of April.
The 17th of April, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. I'm a little bit ahead of time here. Okay. So, welcome back to the interview session, Alan. I think we left off last time talking about Second Life and how important that was for your work, and how you engaged with a sense of alterity in that space, but connectivity as well with other. And how you can build a set of operations there which provide a template for ongoing generative video and audio projects.
It's a complicated situation, because I think people who are in Second Life or any virtual world, they're going to there's a wide variety of relationships they can have with the avatar. I mean, some people identify totally with the avatar. Some identify with it in a sense of as if it were alive. Some see it purely, I think, as a function, as, an origin out of which other things will occur in the environment. Some people see it as a tool for experimentation and nothing more. So it has a very complicated relationship, and I think the relationship's a little bit related to Winnicott's idea of transitive objects as well. In other words, they're partially, for those who are open to it, they can seem partially alive, partially independent, partially organic, and then partially not. You know, and the transitive object referring to things like teddy bears and blankets and things which one clearly knows.
Blue blankets.
Yeah.
Or amenable objects.
Yeah.
So you can think of yourself or place yourself in another environment in order to feel secure. Is that in the Winnicottian sense?
I think for some people it's a very insecure space to be in. I think it really depends again on, you know, who's doing what in relationship to it, how the identifications work, or if they do work.
Right.
I think for some people, not for me, but I think for some people it's also connected with sexuality because there are all kinds of sexual... there's all kinds of sexual activity that goes on, I think, in virtual worlds and probably in gaming worlds as well. I'm not really sure.
So this may seem, you know, like I'm trying to psychoanalyze you, but were you breastfed as a child?
I really don't know, but I would doubt it.
You would doubt it?
I would doubt it.
Because that could, you know, to be Freudian about it, you know, the separation anxiety that you might feel from...
Well, John Bowlby writes... Do you know Bowlby's work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say probably Bowlby's more useful, I think, than Freud.
Well,
I don't think that was the case.
What about Lacan? Jacques Lacan.
Oh, Lord.
He thinks that every relationship that a man has is essentially a masturbatory, onanistic relationship with
I have troubles disentangling Lacan. I do better reading him when I have a drink, alcoholic drink.
Well, we have a bottle.
No, I have to work
could
tonight.
secure,
But I find a lot of it very close to nonsense. I find the idea of the imaginary, real, symbolic, that kind of thing very useful.
Yeah.
But I think it has to be
Well, of course, Zizek makes great use of that.
The only person that I can't read Zizek either. There was a woman by the name of Anika Lemaire who wrote a book called Jacques Lacan, and she had studied with him, and she put it onto a kind of theoretical basis that somebody who reads Freud would be able to understand. And so I got a lot out of reading her, more than I got out of reading Lacan. I mean, I think there's so much mythology in Lacan himself. I think the mirror stage is beautiful, but a lot of cultures don't have mirrors, and they do just fine.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how does this technology actually enter in? Is the technology necessary for the development of the ego? I don't.
Yeah. But in terms of discussing the imaginary, which if you transpose to, you know, Second Life, there's a very strong resemblance, if you like, a kind of recognition that, you know, the famous story in the psychoanalytic lectures where Lacan is out on this boat in the mid-Atlantic, and the fishermen are playing games with him. They say, do you see that tin can over there? And he says, yeah, I see that tin can over there floating on the water. And the fishermen laugh uproariously and they say, well, it doesn't see you. So he spent the next 10 years of his life proving that, in fact, the tin can see him. So that this notion of, the symbolic, you've never heard this one?
No, I never heard that. I'm not sure.
The symbolic and the real, that this is, how we intersect our imaginary life with the symbolic, and how language is the basis of understanding our desires, which have a real basis, but when the only time we ever approach the real is when we're approaching death, which might explain your interest in death.
Oh Lord!
Here we go.
Let's get back to Jacques Hadamard.
Yeah.
Do you know Jacques Hadamard's writing? He was a French mathematician. I think he had some relationship to the Bourbaki, but he was earlier. And he had worked with Einstein, and he wrote this is very anti-Lacanian, and it's much more where I'm coming from. He wrote a book that Dover reprinted, which is where I found it, called On the Psychology of Invention in the Mathematical Field.
Yeah.
And what the book is about is, in fact, that people do not think symbolically. They don't think in language, and he took as the basis for this his analysis and discussion with numerous mathematicians, including Einstein, who he was friends with. Mm-hmm. And Einstein reported, he said, when you're doing your equations, exactly what are you doing? So if the conscious or the unconscious is like a language, one would assume that they're thinking of the equation somehow in terms of language or linguistic structures, but it wasn't the case. And Einstein said, what I'm really doing, what it really feels like to me is I'm moving cloudy masses around.
Right.
And that the language only comes later. The language is literally, not figuratively, but literally an afterthought.
Yeah.
So that the movement is not on the linguistic plane.
Yeah,
and I understand that because in a little bit of math that I've played around with, it's the same thing. If you really watch yourself, you just... Yeah. And a good mathematician is not sitting there calculating all the indices in an equation or looking at the linguistic structure of the equation, but is moving indefinables around. So, to me, that's closer to what's going on in Second Life, even though Second Life is formally grounded in the language, because it's, I forget what it's written in. It might be C++. I really don't know the language it's written in. I forget.
Yeah, I know early on, back in the early 70s, you were constructing a kind of mathematical equivalent to a reality effect. And
what I was saying at the time was that it seems to me there are two vast kinds of structures. And I was thinking about structuralism. Everybody was thinking about structuralism. Yeah. But one of the structures.
Kind of Jack Burnham, The Structure of Art.
Yeah, but I wasn't going. So I was trying to think through the math, but I don't have a math background. Okay, so I think my math was deeply faulty, obviously. But I was interested in what I called immersive and definable structures, and actually, this guy who's been writing on me has picked up on that a little bit. So a definable structure is, say, 3 + 5 = 8. It's not a structure; it's an equation, but you can play with that. You can move it around. You're stepping back into it, you're stepping out of it. You assume, most mathematicians would assume that the equation refers to idealities. Even Gödel believed in it, had a sort of Neoplatonism, or post-Platonism. It wasn't Neoplatonic, but post-Platonism, I think, in relationship to the ontology of numbers, so that on a daily basis, mathematicians assume that what's written on the page or that the mathematics is referring to structures that are highly, highly abstracted, which I believe. The other thing that I was interested in was the idea of immersive structures, which are structures that a human being is engaged with and moves through time, so that there's a kind of effect where the structure is a temporal structure, and you're moving through it, and that temporal structure can operate on a definable structure. So you can have, for example, a structure of consciousness, which is basically a process mathematics. It's undergoing continuous change, and where connections are being made and dissolved continuously, which I think is the way some people think of, neuron stuff, neuron networks, neural networks.
You said this beautiful.
And then the other part is, the definable thing, which is like a crystal. So that's what I was thinking about at the time.
Well, when you get into, the digital world, which you are in now, you sent that beautiful piece today, which I sent an email back saying this is brilliant.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, where you've just unfolded blank into this rarefied system of both language and mathematics. I'm not sure what you started with, or whether you just pushed a series of, or you were just randomly typing in stuff.
No, I wasn't randomly typing in. I was using little scripts.
Little scripts?
And then continuously editing the result.
Right,
yeah.
Right, yeah.
But see,
do you see him doing this?
No.
No, she just sees me at the computer.
Yeah.
But I think also that when you look at the analog and you look at the digital, I did some writing on this, which is actually on the disc, on the flash drive I gave you.
Yeah.
Thinking about the difference or the similarities between the analog and the digital, and for me, this stuff breaks down in so many different ways. If you take a digital anything and you have an infinite raster applied, then you end up with the analog. If you take the analog and you stick it in a group of potential wells, then you get a model of the digital. So the two of them are interlocked. And then when you look at quantum mechanics, it seems in some ways digital, in some ways analog. In those terms you throw out, it seems to me that the digital also refers to two things. First, mathematical idealities like Turing machines, the 0 to 1, which is clearly digital. But it also refers a lot to the corporate. So if you think of a digital picture like a JPEG, you're not only thinking of the fact that this is done by pixels, of which each pixel is independent, so there's no real truth value to it. You can take a pixel, any pixel, and turn it upside down. Reverse the values, for example. But you're also dealing with the corporate thing, because you're dealing with protocols, or a protocol suite, or codecs, in other words. And the codecs are what are really determining what the JPEG is going to look like, how the JPEG is going to come out. So that is a combination that the corporate and capital enter into it, it seems to me, inhere to it in terms of definitions of digital and the way we use it. And then, interestingly enough, Brion, there's this guy, Leon Brion, who, Brillouin, who was a mathematician who's also working in information theory and quantum physics. And he came up with the statements, which I found, I ordered the books, finally tracked them down because I read them in the 60s, that the way we see the universe is partly determined by economics, which you can see in terms of a Large Hadron Collider, because it can go to a certain limit and no farther, because it can only reach a certain energy plateau, and it can't go any farther. So the investigation, there are hints or inferences you can make beyond it, but there's still these limitations. So it's sort of interesting to think of this odd sort of relationship between something that we assume is just, our particular financial system, but to think of that a financial system is also really related in a very deep way to the harnessing of energy, and that the harnessing of energy is then related to what we see. And so he was making these relationships. That's not analog or digital, but it indicates again part of the messiness of trying to observe and come out with any kind of conclusive statements about things. So I was interested. I still am interested in those.
Did you ever read Thomas Pynchon's short story Entropy?
Not that I recall. I probably did.
It was in a book published in 64, 65 called Nelson Algren's Book of Lonely Monsters.
I did read Nelson Algren's Book of Lonely Monsters.
It had a lot of Jewish writers, including Thomas Pynchon, and that essay, I think, was responsible for Entropy getting into the discourse of the contemporary art world.
I think Abraham
1960s.
No, I think that's.
Smithson wrote Entropy in the New Monuments.
Yeah, that I
was
don't.
Published in Art Forum in 1967, I think.
But Abraham Moles was writing, on information theory and aesthetic perception and stuff like that, and that's information theory had entropy as a major part of it. So
and cybernetics. And
cybernetics. Yeah. So it was all there. It was all there in the package.
Norbert Wiener. Anyway, that's not why I raised the question. But entropy has been described as this kind of allegory of the contemporary world. You have this house with an upstairs and downstairs. Upstairs you have this guy called Callisto, who's a physicist, mathematician. He's hermetically sealed his space because he's worried about the encroachment of the heat death, the second law of thermodynamics. He thinks the Earth is going to suffer this cataclysmic collapse of the environment. So he's sealed himself off with his girlfriend in this space. Doesn't go outside. Just sitting there thinking about quantum theory and the second law of thermodynamics. Downstairs, there's this guy. This is like your house up there. Actually, I'm not sure whether you're upstairs or downstairs, but downstairs.
We're upstairs.
Yeah, but downstairs is this guy called Meatball Mulligan, who's having a lease breaking party, and he's started to have. He invites all his friends in for this party that lasts for 2 or 3 days. And people end up sleeping in the bathtub, and they're totally drunk out of their mind and stuff like that. So anyway, the natural evolution of the second law of thermodynamics is sleep. Okay, so he falls asleep downstairs. All his friends fall asleep around him. Some leave. And upstairs, Callisto is getting more and more upset. He thinks that the world is going to end. And so he's telling his girlfriend that how the second law of thermodynamics is going to spell a heat death for the Earth and everyone on it. And she gets sick and tired of this. And she finally breaks the hermetic seal, breaks the window, and lets the outside equilibrize with the inside. And of course, they die. And because they can't handle the shift in atmospheric change. Anyway, that's been read as a paradigm of modern consciousness. This kind of, this mathematical guy who's, contemplating the end of the world, and this realist character living through the real end of the world. In some ways, all of us are going through this entropic condition. We're all dying, basically, even though
we're all also living.
Yeah.
I mean, that was
we're
the whole
also
point.
living.
That was the point. Wait a second, let me say something here.
All right.
I mean, that was the point of Pridgettine and Huygens, that stuff, the non-equilibrium thermodynamics, is that it's not a smooth sail.
Yeah, there's negative.
Otherwise no, it's not entropy, but otherwise you wouldn't have life.
Yeah. But anyway, with the environmental collapse and so on. Anyway, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. Do you think about some of these?
Not along those lines.
Those lines. But you are interested in quantum theory and mathematics.
And we're also, both of us are also interested in issues of extinctions. And, I've given, I forget where I did it. I gave a lecture on it. One of those places I gave a talk on.
Yeah.
I gave a long talk on environmental extinctions but not in relationship.
Well, you know where I'm going with this. I think you're a kind of Callisto figure. And
you think I'm isolated from the real world?
Well, no. I think you're very sensitive and aware of environmental challenges, and in some ways you.
But I also go along with Bernard. You remember Bernard Henri Lévy, one of the nouveau philosophes. Well, I forget the name of the book, but he says somewhere in it, all you can do is raise your fist, that, you can't. I mean, I don't think any of us are capable of stopping capital, for example. No matter how well occupies, the imaginary of the left, so to speak, I don't think they can stop anything.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But what do you think of this Bitcoin revolution that's changing the whole economic order?
I think it's going to crash. I mean, my feeling is like intelligent cars, it's really going to crash, because I think that, and this I'm speaking as a total ignorant outsider only. Right. But I think.
Well, I'm ignorant about it too, and in fact, it frightens me.
No, let me go on.
Yeah. So you take control. Go on.
I'll take control.
Take control.
I think the problem with a lot of these things is the power of hacking. And I think, the Bitcoins have already been hacked into, those systems have already been hacked into, intelligent cars are going to be hacked into. They found in a refrigerator somewhere. Mm-hmm. I think I mentioned this to you before, that was spewing out spam. It was an intelligent, refrigerator on a network with a microprocessor. Mm-hmm. And it's only going to get, I think this kind of thing is only get worse. I think that the networking is far too porous.
Okay, so talk about...
we have 10 more minutes.
Okay, reflect on the high points of your recent artist residency at NSCAD in terms of the production of your work.
The blizzard?
The blizzard?
Was definitely a high point. Mm. I was able to get so much work, and I've been trying to think about blankness and the phenomenology of blankness and the whiteness of blankness.
Yeah.
But I've been trying to do that without bringing in the usual things about death or, the light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing. Yeah. So I'm interested in it as a kind of dream screen, and I want to go back and read some more of this guy, Walter Dendy, who wrote.
Now, are you interested in set theory?
But that has nothing to do with this.
No, but an absent presence always...
Well, whiteness is analog for me. It's not...
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's...
But isn't that...
It's fecund. I mean, you look at it at Blizzard in the whiteout situation, you still have peripheral vision, and it's filled with things. It's both... It's a very kind of in-between state. Mm-hmm. So, no, I don't think of it in terms of set theory. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wouldn't...
So
it's not like white-black or anything like that.
So the equivalent, there's no kind of literary equivalent of that? Or is there?
Not that I know of. I mean, it's interesting because it's like trying to theorize something that's untheorizable. It does relate to this French philosopher Clement Rosset, who wrote an article on the real, and he called it idiotic. Mm-hmm. And he called it idiotic because it's inert. In other words, it doesn't respond to theorizing. Right. It's like substance is substance. So I was thinking about that. Mm-hmm. But I want to go back and think about it a little more when I'm out of here. So that was definitely a high point. Right. Second high point was trying to figure out my relationship to Cape Breton music. We went and we spent 1, 2, 3. We spent 4 very full nights. I mean, the minimum was like 3 hours. Listening to Louis Benoit and Dave McIsaac and Wendy.
Your former life,
McIsaac.
In your former life, you may have been an Irish or a Scottish fiddler.
And Seth Peters, the 4 of them.
Or sitar player, maybe.
No, I'm not so interested in that. That's so complicated. Maybe Taksim, Arabic. Yeah. Arabic Taksim. I really love it.
Have you had your DNA tested?
Not recently, no. I think I'd fail.
Because I did it some years ago, and I've been doing work through my DNA.
I might have to do that. I might ask you more about that.
Yeah, but your MT DNA, because you can trace the mother's DNA right back to the mother, the African mother. So you can look at the movement of your genetic origins through Africa, up through Ethiopia, up through India, the Caucasus, and through
wherever it goes.
Yeah, and then up through and then down. It's very, very interesting.
I think mine probably started and stopped in Newark.
Yeah. Good. I could just see that in the interview now. Interviewer and interviewee collapse in laughter. Newark. Yeah. So anyway, where were we?
So you were asking about high points. So those are high points.
High points, yeah.
I think going past Peggy's Cove out towards Mahone Bay and seeing harlequin ducks
Yeah.
at Peggy's Cove, because they're rare. We don't see them in the South. They're not that common here, apparently. So seeing Harlequin ducks was a high point, yeah.
It's a pity you didn't see your exhibition when it was up.
No, I know.
Because it was absolutely gorgeous. It was just like stunning. You know,
Oh, that's
people
great.
went in, they just looked around, and it was, you know, like something that people hadn't seen in Gallery 1 before.
Craig Leonard told me that his class decided it was all psychedelic. And Azure pointed out to Craig that I don't take drugs.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, and you met Craig, you spent a lot of time with David and also...
With you.
Yeah, with me
And Michael Fernandez.
and Michael Fernandez.
And Eleanor.
And you met with some really interesting grads. You met with Michael.
And Mar.
And Mar.
Yeah.
And they really benefited from you spending time with them. Yeah.
And there was...
We met with Michael's class.
Yeah.
Michael's
and,
class.
We gave a talk to Craig's class, and then we met with one of Craig's students,
Mm-hmm.
Aiden.
Aiden, who's really, really smart. I could learn a lot from him.
I
He
think
was the coding
Yeah,
guy.
coding guy.
I think a high point too, I mean, is not as a physical attraction, but you've been thinking a lot about how productive you are in relation to being in a supportive environment. The school's been very welcoming, and everyone's been very welcoming, and how that sort of frees one up to...
Because Providence is exactly the opposite. It's like being for me, it's like being in a black hole.
Yeah. Well, you know, the last person I interviewed here was Oliver Ressler, who was... Did I show you the books of the interviews that I did?
Should I turn this off for a minute?
Yeah.